Extra large inhumane crime in the 20th century. The Japanese villains deprived me of my youth. I can't repress a surging indignation. They are barbarians in human skin. They are the sworn enemy of our Korean women. We must pay off our pent-up grudge at any cost. The voice of the victims of the sexual slavery by the Japanese army is ringing in the 21st century following the 20th century. Never in human history spanning thousands of years has there been such a sexual slavery system as that of the Japanese army. The frightening, inhumane crime Japan committed in the 20th century, however, is often denied by the Japanese reactionaries. They try to distort history by describing Japan as a scapegoat, innocent, but being considered to be a criminal state by others. Now, let us look into the history of their wicked crimes. In 1946, right after the Second World War, the Tokyo International Military Court sentenced capital punishment on Tojo and other major war criminals of Japan. But the unheard of crimes of sexual slavery was not mentioned there, for the Japanese imperialists had craftily concealed the vicious, inhumane crimes. In the early 1990s, the Asahi Shimbun and other newspapers reported materials pertaining to the criminal sexual slavery for the Japanese army, the materials that were discovered by some conscientious Japanese. According to materials discovered at the U.S. National Archives, a U.S. Army intelligence service at the end of World War II examined more than 20 comfort women for the Japanese army. The examination materials prove that the sexual slavery by the Japanese army was an organized criminal act directly committed by the Japanese government and military. At this, Kim Hak-sun, a South Korean woman, indicted Japan first. She was followed by others who, in defiance of shame, opened to the public what they had experienced. The United Nations and other international humanitarian organizations also turned out in investigation. It thus led to the revealing of the sexual slavery by the Japanese army, though not full. Driven into a corner by denunciation and protest of the world public, Japan reluctantly acknowledged its crime and apologized for it in August 1993 through a press statement by the then Chief Cabinet Secretary, Kono. Nevertheless, the former Prime Minister Abe and other ultra-rightist elements negated even the reserved apology. They are so arrogant as to clamor that having used Korean women for comfort's sake was not an illegal and criminal act. The former Deputy Cabinet Secretary of Japan went so far as to brazenly say that comfort girls had come into being because parents sold their daughters. But in truth, Japan officially introduced the comfort woman system. Japan, therefore, must bear state responsibility for that. Dr. Lee Cheol-hong of the Academy of Social Sciences says that the Japanese imperialists' policy on comfort woman system began to be implemented in Korea. From the late 1920s, after occupying Korea, the Japanese imperialists installed comfort houses in Rajin, Chongjin, and Hwaryong. Typical of them are the ones in Punggok-dong and Bangjin-dong. Sexual slavery existed in Korea between the late 1920s and August 1945, with comfort houses as its basis. The Punggok-dong Comfort House in Ranam existed for nearly 20 years, unprecedented in history. The comfort house was run exclusively by the military. Such a comfort house could be found not in the Ranam 19th Division alone. In the middle of the 1930s, the Japanese imperialists set up comfort houses for the Navy named Punghae-ru and Eunwol-ru in Japanese buildings in Bangjin-dong, Cheongjin City, North Hamgyong Province of Korea. Such comfort houses, no better than animal pens, were installed in Haesan, Incheon, Seoul, Busan, and Daegu. In those dens of hell, a large number of Korean women had to undergo indescribable maltreatment and indignities. During the Sino-Japanese War, since the September 18th incident, the Japanese imperialists took many Korean women to the foremost front area and used them as sex slaves. It was an inhumane crime produced by extreme national chauvinism. The sexual slavery introduced by the Japanese in Shanghai and Nanjing, China, was perpetrated by the government and military under the order and approval of the Japanese king. The fact was testified by the then high-ranking officers of the Japanese army. An official document reads, "As there are occurring many incidents of rape by men of the army, comfort houses shall be installed immediately to prevent this kind of crisis." This document proves that the Ministry of the Army organized and managed the sexual slavery system for the Japanese army under the approval of the Japanese king. It was signed by the then Deputy Minister of the Army, Umezu Yoshijiro, in April 1938 as the highest document after a royal decree. In his reminiscences, Aso Detzo, who was an army surgeon of the occupation army in Shanghai, testified that early in 1938, at the beginning of the Sino-Japanese War, an examination of venereal disease was held for over 100 comfort girls in a comfort house managed by the army. The examination proved that 80% of them was Korean women. The examination documents show that the main part of the sex slaves for the Japanese army was Korean women. It can be confirmed by a testimony of Kameko Yasuji, who was a member of the 44 Battalion of the 57th Division of the North Chinese Army. At that time, the Japanese army levied comfort girls in the occupied areas under the direction of the army commander. It was difficult to implement on the strength of the Ministry of the Army alone, and it was impossible at all without the support of state power. Like this, the sexual slave system for the Japanese army was directly confabed and carried out by the government and military of Japan. The fact was also proved by a document of a joint meeting of 3 ministries, the Ministry of the Army, the Ministry of the Navy, and the Foreign Ministry of Japan in April 1938. At a time of military trainings to invade the Soviet Union called Special Trainings of the Kwangdong Army in 1941, the Japanese imperialists requested the Korean government general to levy 20,000 convict girls and took nearly 10,000 convict girls, as was testified by Hara Genshiro, who was the former staff member of the Japanese army. Requested by the military, the Korean government general issued a directive to police bureaus in provinces and the police bureaus to police stations in counties and sub-counties to take numerous Korean women. Since the Pacific War in 1941, the Japanese imperialists levied convict women on a larger scale, and Korean sex slaves were seen in all places where Japanese aggressors went. When the Pacific War got fiercer, they could not provide convict girls to the Southern Army enough. They intensified the requisition of convict women. This is a document on taking more convict women. As the documents show, the then King of Japan, Hirohito, the paramount ruler of Japan, did not forbid the criminal sexual slavery, but connived and encouraged it. And Tojo, Prime Minister and, concurrently, Army Chief, approved it and ensured their kidnapping and transportation. As there were needed more convict women, the Japanese imperialists totally scrapped formalities for traveling abroad and inspection for foreign travelers, which they conducted during the Sino-Japanese War, and the military was charged with convict women's going abroad. As a result, the system of foreign tour certificate was completely nullified. A victim, Park Young-sim, testifies. While staying at my grandmother's home, I was deceived by a Japanese who suggested going to earn money. At that time, I went by train all day long and arrived in Nanjing, China. As you see in this record, it was impossible to kidnap as many as 200,000 Korean women individually. It was possible only by the government and military authorities. It was really an extra large inhumane crime. Those who served in the old Japanese army say, Hayami Masanori says, I knew the women by face, but didn't know they were pregnant. There were some tents surrounded by barbed wire entanglements, and we lived separately from the Korean convict girls. I knew almost all of them, Hanako, Umiko, Nobuko, Mazuko, and others. The Korean convict girls were called by the Japanese names. In the murderous comfort house, the sexual slave life of the Korean women was more cruel than the situation of slaves in the medieval times. They were forbidden to speak Korean to each other and to go out and have contact with outsiders. They were called by Japanese names instead of their original names or by numbers. They were forced to serve as sex slaves. In the latter half of the 1920s, comfort houses were installed in different places of Korea. Korean comfort women were taken not only to different areas of Korea and China, but to all occupied areas in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. What was then the origin of the cruelty and moral vulgarity peculiar to Japan? The state of samurais, formed by the Meiji Restoration in 1868, was a society with an extreme discrimination of men and women. Japan stipulated it by law to ignore the personality and dignity of women. As a result, there appeared the prostitution management system unprecedented in the history of the world. A Japanese scholar, Senta Kako, in an article said, Japanese militarism legalized the discrimination of women and made 200,000 Korean women sex slaves, and its method was the same with the medieval slave hunting method. A woman victim says, one day, some Japanese gripped me suddenly and tied me with a rope and then took me by truck. They carried me all night to somewhere. But today, they say the Korean women became comfort girls for the Japanese army for money-making. How shameless and brazen-faced they are. I'd like to ask them why they didn't send their daughters for such a money-making. If their parents and wives and daughters were forced to suffer such misfortune, what they would do?
자기 부모 처자들이 그런 끔찍한 불행과 고통을 강요당했다면 어떻게 했겠냐?
Like this, when Korean women were taken as comfort girls for the Japanese army, almost all of them were teenagers and unmarried girls. They didn't know to where and for what they were taken. Their parents bitterly lamented after being deprived of their dear daughters. The shameless Japanese samurais took more than 200,000 Korean women as sex slaves, but today they are crying about somebody's kidnapping issue. The former journalist of the Mainichi newspaper, Shisano, said the Korean comfort girls did not volunteer but were kidnapped. Kidnapped or cheated, Korean women were treated like munitions and always the first to be transported. Being treated not as human beings but like goods, they were carried far away, shedding bitter tears of a ruined nation. In Japan proper, however, Japanese girls were amusing themselves every day. A Japanese researcher on the problem of women, Suzuki Yuko, in an article to magazine Sekai, wrote, the tyrannical Japanese army did not send their children as comfort girls, not because they respected their human rights, but for preventing their reproductive function from being deteriorated. When comfort women for the Japanese army were hunted in the Korean peninsula, Japan proper cried for giving birth to more children. On the basis of such calculation, they decided to take girls from colonies. Herein lay the evident racial discrimination and the nature of colonial domination. If war lasted for 10 years, almost all Korean young women would not have escaped such a fate. Then, what made the Japanese imperialists commit the crime of sexual slavery? They schemed to exterminate the Korean nation on the earth forever. Just for this purpose, the Japanese imperialists took girls underage. The life in the comfort houses forced by the Japanese imperialists was an immoral crime run through with the idea of human hatred. A woman victim testifies. A Japanese shouted, "Take off your Korean clothes." I refused. At this, he forcibly stripped off my clothes. The Japanese considered rape not to be a violation of human rights and crime, but to be a gift of the emperor, thereby revealing themselves as sex mania and immoral scoundrels and committing all kinds of shameless crimes. The then Japanese Army Lieutenant Tsuda says, "Whenever we went to the comfort house, we said, Korean girls must be obedient to the imperial army or else die. That is the way for you to support the order of the Japanese emperor." A woman victim, Kim Yong-soo, testifies the Japanese Army's crime of sexual slavery as an extreme debasement of women and human beings. Just that is the real proof, showing the genuine color of the Japanese beasts in human skin. In the comfort house, the Japanese imperialists ruthlessly trampled underfoot the youth of Korean women. Because they were deprived of the country, Korean women were dragged to the faraway alien land and suffered all kinds of ill treatment and contempt. Buried in deep grief, they yearned for the home villages and sang in tears. My home village is a flowering mountain and river. I yearn for the day when I played there. Their last fate was a horrible death, a witness says. Unable to further endure the miserable life of sex slave, Nam Chun-ja, called Minami Haruko, escaped the Bangjin-dong comfort house, but was arrested. She was cruelly beaten to death. This is the tomb of that woman. When they were to bloom in the warm love of their parents, so many Korean girls were mercilessly killed by murderers. The Japanese imperialists killed comfort women in large numbers at the time of their defeat. The aim of it was to eliminate the witnesses of the sexual slavery system for the Japanese army. Referring to the truculent murder by the Japanese imperialists, Anabune, the former deputy speaker of the House of Representatives of Japan, in an article contributed to a book, The Eye of Our Time, admitted 142,000 Korean comfort girls were killed by Japanese soldiers. We ask the conscience of the world public, how can they work off their deep-rooted grudge? The Women's International Court of War Crimes 2000, to judge the criminal sexual slavery for the Japanese army, convicted Japanese King Hirohito and sexual slavery criminals who had not been indicted to the Tokyo International Military Court. It proved the truth of history that inhumane crimes would be settled down through generations.
And as such is criminally liable for all of the charges filed.
Human history has recorded a lot of wars, but it is only Japan that committed an extra large immoral crimes, while taking numerous women from children in their teens to married women as sex slaves to battlefields. Japan is the sworn enemy who deprived as many as 200,000 Korean women of their rights as women and mothers. But now, Japan is crying about somebody's kidnapping issue, which has already been settled. It is an intolerable challenge to justice and human conscience. Japan is denying the forcible character of the sexual slavery and distorting history. It more clearly shows Japan's base morality. By doing so, Japan is committing manifold crimes. The brazen-faced act will never escape the punishment of history. Japan's act is evoking greater indignation and denunciation of the world public. They say the Japanese government should recognize the criminal sexual slavery perpetrated half a century ago. The crime against comfort women for the Japanese army is an immoral crime unprecedented in war history. The Japanese government must apologize for this crime as a political issue. Japan must make a genuine apology and appropriate compensation. We shall find out in the United States all documents related to war crimes of Japan and open them to the public. The Congress of the United States, the senior ally of Japan, adopted a resolution calling for recognizing the criminal sexual slavery and apologizing for it. Many countries of the world are eliminating the criminal past and going along the road of reconciliation and cooperation. On the contrary, however, Japan is distorting history and evading the elimination of the past. Japan is clinging to its old dream for Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Herein lies the grave danger of the Japanese reactionaries' machinations to distort history and escape the elimination of its past. Japan entered the 21st century without eliminating its criminal past. Its shameless act is further increasing the Korean people's anti-Japanese sentiment. Korean women today are not what they were in the past when they had to undergo disgrace. Japan is our sworn enemy who infringed upon the honor and dignity of many Korean women and were hell-bent to eradicate the Korean nation. The Korean people can never forget Japan's extra-large, inhumane crimes. Japan disgraced the 20th century to the last. The judgment of history has not yet ended. Japan has no future as long as it fails to apologize for its past crimes and make compensation.